Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm so excited that you're here. Today, I would like to share The Kids Are All Right with Voting, a case study in using mobile devices as ethnographic research tool. My name is Jonathan Struby, and I'm an assistant professor of graphic design at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. In fall 2018, students in an advanced visual communication course in Northern Illinois University were asked what type of project they would like to work on. Often, students in this course would work on a long-form branding project or campaign with an emphasis on research strategy and polymodal deliverables. Given my pedagogical focus on humanity-centered research techniques, I asked students if they would be interested in working on a socially driven topic and project. I was met with a unanimous yes. All students in the class were open to and wanted to participate in a project that they felt was socially relevant and dealt with real-life content. As 2018 was a midterm election year and one perceived of having great consequence, I presented students with the data from the United States Census Bureau. This data clearly displayed that their social demographic, voters age 18 to 29, were the least likely to participate in the upcoming election. I asked them a simple question: why? The process for this project exposed students to human-centered research methods and to craft and design a social campaign. The audience for the campaign were NIU students or local contemporaries in the age range of this voting demographic, 18 to 29. The objective for the campaign was to create communication that would educate, motivate, and promote these 18 to 29-year-old voters to participate in the national democratic elections. To do this, students followed a process that included assumptive research, problem prioritization, ethnographic interviews, data analysis, hypothesis creation, and solution prototyping. Let's start with assumptive research. To start the design process, students did assumptive research as a group, and as a part of the subject demographic, students worked together to brainstorm reasons what they believed was causing the rate of voter participation. Through the process, students completed simple Google searches, read news reports, talked with friends, and drew from their own personal experience to clarify their assumptions about the voting process. The main goal of the exercise was to get all preconceived factors on the table relative to the identified problem. And what you're looking at here is just a good old-fashioned workshop where students work together in groups collaboratively to try to just identify every single assumption possible. Next, they moved on to problem prioritization. Students outlined trends in their assumptions and created thematic areas from which to develop interview questions. These themes that were identified as areas of focus were personal problems, social and cultural factors, the voting process, the act of voting, ideology, philosophy, and party identification, physical limitations, and finally, the media. Here you see just a close-up view of how they use that workshopping process to look for redundancies and to organize their assumptions into these areas of focus. Next, we move on to the ethnographic interviews. Within these areas that were developed from the prioritization, students categorized specific questions that composed a questionnaire from which they conducted their interviews. In conducting the interviews, the ethnographic interviews, students intentionally created a series of binary questions, yes or no, that would produce measurable data to be shared and interpreted. First, they started with demographics. How old are you? Where are you from? What is your gender identity? What is your ethnicity? And have you voted in past elections? Then they moved on to personal problems. Does your schedule impact your ability to vote? Next, social and cultural. Do you think your vote makes a difference? Does your family or friends influence your voting habits? Are you aware of the upcoming election? Do you know the date of the upcoming election? Next, process. Are you registered to vote? Do you know how to register? Do you know where to cast your vote? And are there any technical reasons preventing you from voting, i.e. legal, citizenship, etc.? Act. Would you participate more if remote or mail-in voting was used nationwide? And have you used that before? Then, ideology, philosophy, or party. Do you think the two-party system is effective? Do you think the government is functioning effectively to accurately represent the population? And then finally, physical limitations. Is there anything physically preventing you from making it to the polling location? And media influence. Does media, celebrity, or social memes influence your participation? And what we're looking at here is a simple output of the shared Google Doc that students created and used as the backdrop for all the ethnographic interviews that they were to create. From there, students conducted their ethnographic interviews. With questions defined, students set out to complete their research, to test their assumptions, and to develop the case study that could be applied to a larger collective issue. These interviews were classified as ethnographic and not just qualitative research because they were comprised of one-on-one interviews that looked to understand the behaviors and rituals of a specific social group. And what you see here are some preliminary interview sets that took place between students. And you'll notice their use of mobile devices. To prepare for their interviews, students were provided and referenced readings on conducting ethnographic interviews from Doing Oral History by Donald A. Ritchie. And as a collaborative discussion, students discussed and outlined the necessary goals in performing these interviews. They included both theoretical and practical considerations to connect with those that designers were looking to serve. The criteria that they developed guided and prepared them for the interview process to ensure that the questions and interactions probed directly at the topic and were executed consistently. First, students talked about identify the specific group of people. Through the concept of ethnography, the interviewee is determined by the outlined demographic or social factors. This specifically identifies the groups to be interviewed, but more importantly, identify who is not to be interviewed. Then, conduct interviews on a neutral ground or in a subject's own space. Students discussed how important it was, if possible, to observe the person, their body language, and personal space. This allowed student interviewees to also employ observational research, being aware of the contextual symbols and messages that often reveal a more detailed understanding of the subject. Open up the interview with questions general to the topic. Students use this tactic to make the interview comfortable with the process. In this case, the students started with basic demographic questions to serve this purpose, but also established important data markers for their research. Questions are prepared ahead of time. Referencing their shared questionnaire, students were able to ensure that they did not forget questions and gathered all the necessary and required data for analysis. Ask questions, notate, and video answers. To do this, students completed the task with the use of their personal mobile devices. This is an important factor that allows students to observe their personal design agency. By using this personal mobile device, students were able to observe their objects differently. Students now saw the devices as research tools and not merely a passive object that served as an extension of their personal identity. Notes should be exact, not interpretations. Students were also tasked with transcribing their interviews. These transcriptions were typed and saved with each video to ensure that the captured data would not be lost due to technical failure of the video. Always get permission first. Students also function with industry best practices. Students were required to complete a photo-video release form for each interview subject. These documents were signed, gathered, scanned, and posted to a shared drive, ensuring proper documentation. All media should be backed up. Students collected and cataloged all interview information in central shared drive. This shared drive served as a course depository, but also a secondary file backup system to the one the students were working from. Next, after completing the interview process, each student analyzed a specific interview question and visualized the data in two separate ways. The first visualization focused on holistic data and presented the percentage of yes/no responses relative to the number of total responses and the corresponding percentages. Then each student took a thematic question and cross-referenced it with the demographic data captured in questions 1 through 4. The second visualization was a segmented chart that visualizes the relationship between demographic factors and the relative question. This process also allowed the class to share the workload and speed up the analysis of all of the captured questions. And these visualizations served also as a research narrative for each student's final campaign strategy documentation book. What we see here on the left and right are students presenting data to each other in class after analysis was captured from all the questions and all the interviewees that each of the students performed. Some important trends from this process were gathered from over 150 interviews. 56% of respondents did not know the date of the 2018 election. 56% of respondents would participate more with remote or mail-in ballots. 67% of respondents do not think the two-party system is effective, and 76% of respondents do not think that the government represents them accurately. So, as I stated, students created a strategy book and a documentation of their research. And here we're going to look at a few spreads from that same student that we saw on the left to sort of create equity between those two images. This allowed the students to both document the process and the research, but also it created a logical foundation for the solutions that they would later present in the course. And so these are just a few spreads of the students working through that. Next, students moved on to their hypothesis creation. This question was created after each student identified what they believed to be the most pressing factor. The factor served as a primary premise for the creation of their social campaign and supporting artifacts. And what you see here is another student presenting their hypothesis question, specifically, how can candidate policy information be made more accessible, more effectively communicated to ensure participation among the youth? And we see the corresponding digital and analog strategies or artifacts that would be created by the student. After hypothesis creation, there was a lot of good old-fashioned design process with sketching and iterating and working together as a collective group to develop their ideas relative to the hypothesis they each posed. Here we see just several sketches and things pulled from the wall that gave us some unique insights into how students were thinking about using the analog, digital, and experiential platforms. One unique sort of process that we often used was the what if game, where students would present where they were with the project, and then they would have a what if scenario where students would answer that question, their contemporaries, colleagues, by writing a response to the what if and placing it as a sticky note next to their sketches or wherever they were in the process. And the caveat to this is that students are not able to sort of respond to the what ifs, but they have to take those back and analyze analyze them through their own design process and think about the application or the necessity of what their fellow colleagues had presented through the discussion. And finally, after all of the classic design process, we had solution prototyping that would evolve. Each student created a conceptual solution to engage their demographic. They presented a strategic campaign with supporting graphic and artifact material. The students also had to deal with a multi-dimensional solution consisting of analog and digital in 3 dimensions. These strategic campaigns and solutions were presented in a formal presentation at the end of the project that clearly explained and visualized the outcomes. And we'll return to that student that we've used as a bit of a case study here. This student focused on registration as being the most pressing topic, and they dug into ways to develop a registration packet that was a little bit more well-designed and focused on equity and communication. The student named their campaign Ready, Set, Register, and they developed a simple presentation that allowed voters to identify the registration requirements, complete the registration application, and mail it in and return it to be to ensure that they were registered to vote. The student also created a registration app that would deal with the digital aspect of this, where folks could also use technology to ensure that they were registered to vote and maintain the voter database through their own personal updating of this information. And so here we see on the right and further screens of a simplified approach to entering and organizing this information relative to the desired outcome of registering to vote. And so the student prototyped these. As well, the student, in terms of 3 dimensions, thought about pop-up registration booths that would look to close the gap between both the printed and the digital solution. So thinking about low-income or low-access areas where folks may not have smartphones and they may not have a reliable address where they could get mail. These pop-up locations would allow for both the digital registration and ensure that folks could register to vote regardless of their current personal situation. So that brings us to the findings of this process. So the findings of this project are anecdotal in nature, but they speak to support a pedagogical approach that engage students in socially focused project. Design students preferred a project that had holistic collaborative process. Through each phase of the process, students worked directly with their colleagues to brainstorm, workshop, identify, and create possible solutions. Through each phase, students were dependent on each other. Design students want to be involved and use their education in real time to relate to larger systemic issues. They do not want to see their time in the classroom as idle and spent on abstract exercises, but rather as tangible experiences that are applicable to their future. Design students were engaged by information that was real, accessible, and that could serve them as a design student, but more importantly, as a human. Even if their project was not a success, they were further educated and better equipped to engage in the voting process on their own, regardless of the outcomes in the course. Design students are capable of doing ethnographic research and investigative work. Initially, students were apprehensive about conducting one-on-one interviews. Specifically, they were apprehensive about the effort and engagement that was necessary to capture a critical mass of feedback. Although once students gained momentum in the interview process, they found it to be enlightening in understanding the problem and the resulting design work. Design students saw that they could be empowered by their personal mobile devices. They were empowered by the concept that they are equipped with tools to conduct and record interviews. It also changed the way that they perceived the application of media produced by the device. They saw that the device could help them record and produce thematic content to support their overall design process. And finally, I'd like to share a few reflections about this project. In spring of 2020, advanced graphic design students at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, were to participate in this project. The participation would have provided a second demographic case study and data set from a different location. The hope was that this data would have been used to widen the research. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, students were not able to reliably complete their ethnographic interviews. The uncertainty of the virus, social interactions, participation, and schedules were barriers to participation. Strangely, though, there's validation in the solutions proposed by students. As social distancing has questioned why or how in-person voting takes place, our country is being forced to respond. States such as Wisconsin and Texas are ruling against mail-in ballots, even for absentee voting. And states such as Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington allow state mail-in voting for all registered voters. The point is that our current standard for registering, voting, and participating in our democracy must evolve. The youth get it, and ultimately the kids are all right with voting. In fact, they want to be engaged and participate in the democratic process. These students found that all parts of the voting process need to evolve. I am hopeful that students like these can help to design a more equitable system for our democracy. So simply, go vote, please. Again, my name is Jonathan Struby. If you have any questions or would like to reach out, my email is jstruby@unomaha.edu. I thank you for your time. Be well, be healthy. Thank you.